And let's get into our first big topic of the day, which was an article that we wrote, which was 10 players who should have been traded at the deadline. And I threw a couple extra ones on this list to cover the teams that maybe sold but didn't sell all that we thought that they would. So two of the players that sort of headline this list are the guys that we talked about a lot coming in from the White Sox. That's Luis Robert and Garrett Crochet. We thought that these would be the two biggest names moved at the deadline. Both of them stay put. Is that the right move for the White Sox? We could talk about what they did do because there's a lot to be debated about there. But with those two players, did they make the right call to hold off and try to revisit this in the offseason?
Yes. I think a lot of White Sox fans probably would not agree with that take. But I think Luis Robert Jr. is a player that you want to get in, theoretically, 29 other teams in the bidding on. And you're going to get a much better haul for him, I feel, in the offseason when there are, again, more players that are more players in the game as far as teams are concerned. So I think he just really wasn't on the market for them going into the deadline. And then Garrett Crochet, maybe putting his foot in his mouth, if you will, that kind of really muddled his market even more so. I think we've said it many times, this idea that he's already thrown more innings than he has in his previous 4 years in the big leagues. And there's questions about whether he's going to need Tommy John. He's got 2 more years, and he's not going to make a ton of money in arbitration, but you only have him for 2 more years. And if he does need Tommy John, what are you actually getting? So it was a hard situation to begin with, but as soon as he said, I don't want to go to the bullpen, and he made certain comments that really, I think, handcuffed GM Chris Getz in a big way. So I think they would have liked a much better haul than what they ended up getting. But I think the White Sox did the best that they could, all things considered. And maybe if they can sign Crochet to an extension, that improves his value even more so and gets them more of a runway of saying, hey, look, he doesn't need Tommy John. He made it through all of 2024. He's feeling good going into 2025. So I think it's disappointing, but very understandable.
Last year they were in a similar situation with Dylan Cease, and they didn't move him. Now the difference, I guess, was Dylan Cease's trade value was not maybe as high as it would have been, in years past, but then they still end up trading before this season starts. I'd have to check back in to see how that return has panned out for them, but I think you can defend not trading either of those guys because it makes sense why a market would materialize. And considering the prices, it's almost like the prices were so high for the rentals or the middle of the rotation starters. It's almost like it made that price so far out for the starters that it made them harder to attain. That's why we didn't see any of those guys moved, Crochet, Skubal, Snell. But they did trade Eric Fetty, and they, in the same trade, packaged Michael Kopech and Tommy Pham, but they only get 3, I think maybe 4 prospects. There's a player to be named later in it from the Dodgers. The Cardinals somehow make out like bandits where they don't even trade a prospect in that deal, just give up Tommy Edman. So I think when you look at it that way, the White Sox end up being losers at this deadline because they didn't get more for Fetty. And they also, I feel like with some of the other relievers that went, Michael Kopech might have had a little bit more value. And to staple him into that deal, staple Pham into that deal, it just seems like that was one of the worst trades of the deadline in retrospect, based on what other teams got for their pieces.
I know in the Rockies world, there was some concern or disappointment because, sure, they got 3 pitching prospects, which is obviously a good thing to bolster that farm system. But when you compare them to all the other teams that were sellers, they were 9th in terms of the 9 teams that were just straight up sellers and did not acquire or did not give up any prospects. So you look at it from that perspective and you say, you don't feel as good about the Rockies prospects. Same thing for the White Sox, a team that had everything to sell. How many of these guys are going to be around for their next, not even postseason contender, but their next relevant club? Sell any and everyone. And for them to not end up with the 10 plus prospects, like we saw the Marlins and like we saw the Blue Jays, it's very understandable why White Sox fans are a little frustrated.
Especially because last year they were the team that sold pretty much everything they could outside of a Dylan Cease because the market didn't materialize. And again, you'd feel better about that. So yeah, I think the White Sox were one of the big losers. Getting back to players who should have been traded that weren't. We talked about the Blue Jays there. It's hard to kind of grade what they did because I think in a lot of ways they did very well. For one, the Yusei Kikuchi package was huge. And then getting what they could for Justin Turner, Jimmy Garcia, and others, they did a nice job trading their rentals. But if you got that haul for Kikuchi, why not put Chris Bassett on the table? I think I can sort of understand Bo Bichette and Vladdy staying, although Vladdy would have got them a haul too. But Bassett in particular makes no sense to me. The guy's making $21 million, something like that. He's in his mid-30s. You don't know how he's going to be able to hold up and pitch next year, though that is part of his benefit, his durability. I just think that was a huge wasted opportunity to not trade Chris Bassett at this deadline.
Peter Apple said it, I think, really well on our Just Baseball Trade Deadline show. Go back and check that out. I think still has plenty of relevance here, just a couple of days out. But they kind of kicked the can down the road just a little bit. Like, I think they bought themselves that one extra year before Bo Bichette and Vlad Guerrero Jr. become free agents after 2025. And we kind of thought that maybe they would do that with Bassett being one of those key players, as opposed to just about everybody else. So it does give them that opportunity to run it back in 2025. But should they be doing that with for those two players? Is that kind of postponing that next rebuild? Are there still enough pieces that are there? Obviously, there's a ton of investment, but at the same time, you might need to really make that decision. You might not be able to bring both of those guys back. Are you waiting for the next year's trade deadline to be in it a little bit more so and have that final bite at the apple? I don't know. So I think I understand it for these generational players. It's okay for that 1 year to kick the can down the road. But if you don't agree with that, I definitely respect that opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you can make the case that if Vladdy's having another good season next year and they're out of it, they can probably get at least 80 cents on the dollar for what they would have got this deadline. And Bo Bichette is having such a bad year and was hurt. So again, those I can sort of absolve. The Bassett one to me is the one that I think is inexcusable, because you could have taken $20 million and signed a comparable free agent and netted yourself probably 3 really good prospects at this deadline had you traded them. I didn't think you would have had to eat much of that contract at all. So that's the one that I think that they should be kicking themselves on. But again, you know what? Next year, if the Blue Jays are great and Chris Bassett's a big part of that, well, I'll eat my words on it. The Angels are the next.
Let me say this. I don't know if this has been mentioned much, and I haven't seen too many GMs discussing this in particular. I know the GM of the Rockies has yet to really speak to media, but I wonder how much of the fact that this deadline came together so late, because there were only a few teams and it was still, hey, are the Giants going to sell? Are the Reds going to sell? Those fringy teams, you got to figure out what they're going to do. Are the Cubs going to sell? They should, but they end up buying. And I'm wondering if GMs like Ross Atkins almost ran out of time. Like you said, you get that Kikuchi deal and you go, hey, you know what? We were thinking about holding on to this guy for whatever reason. Now let's go ahead and deal him. Hey, the clock's running out. We really don't have enough time to get this going. So I wonder how much of time, the fact that really the deadline did not develop until only a couple of days out, I wonder how much that hindered GMs from doing their job.
Well, I think it's a good point as far as just the general speed and pace of the market. For the Bassett situation in particular, they sent out the signal where they said, we're not trading anyone. We're not trading Bassett. We're not trading Gus. We're not trading these guys that are under contract beyond this year. And in some ways, maybe that focused things in. Maybe that allowed them to get more for Kikuchi, because otherwise maybe the Astros would have been just hammering, can we get Bassett? Can we get Bassett? But I feel like you don't need to. Like, I guess that's for fans. I don't know what that does to take guys off the table and not just hear out their market. You know what I mean? So to me, I would have liked to see them listen, because I think Bassett could have netted them more. But again, we'll never know what it could have been. The Angels are a team that I think comes out of this as losers, because they have 2 of the top 10 players that should have been traded, Taylor Ward and Luis Rengifo. I mean, we just got some more bad injury news on Mike Trout, which unfortunately is just status quo. He tears the same meniscus in his knee. So rest of this season's out. Try again next year, see what you get. But it doesn't feel like the Mike Trout window is going to net much for the Angels when it comes to winning. And you have these guys that don't fit the Shenwell window or the Zach Neto window, or all these young guys that have come up, Logan O'Hoppe. They are, pieces that have limited control that would have been among the best position players with this deadline. And I just don't get how they couldn't find anything. When Lane Thomas gets the package that he does from the Guardians, how does Taylor Ward not have something similar on the table? Jazz Chisholm gets what he does for the Marlins. How does Luis Rengifo not have that package available somewhere? So those 2 guys should have been moved for me.
I wonder just how much the relationship that GMs have with one another is a factor in this. And I would think it's a lot. I've talked about this with a lot of people in the Rockies media and people that are attached to the team. The Rockies in particular are a club that I think has painted themselves into a corner. You talk about pulling players off the market and not even hearing it out. Rockies did that with Ryan McMahon. They did it a couple of years ago with Daniel Bard as the best closer in baseball. They did that with their best starting pitcher in John Gray, thinking they could re-sign him, and it didn't work. And so I think that with how the Angels do business, or their owner, Artie Moreno, and kind of doing a little bit of meddling, I wonder how much teams are not as willing to put in the time, because it could all be for naught. So as you said, the Lane Thomas deal, Mike Rizzo's wheeling and dealing, and there might be a GM that says, you know what, it's worth investing this much time, and it's worth investing this extra prospect capital. Whereas you're right, I think Taylor Ward he definitely would have gotten more than a Lane Thomas, especially I think with the extra year of club control. But even still, you have to have those conversations. You have to have those relationships. You have to have other GMs willing to put in that time with you. And I don't know that the Angels have that. And I think that's a disadvantage that they have, but that's all part of their making, right? That's all part of their creation. And if you're a fan of the Angels, I don't think you have confidence to say, well, you still have Rengifo for another year, so you can revisit any trades for him this offseason. You've got Ward for 2 more years, so again, revisit it this offseason. You don't have that confidence because of the other wheelings and dealings that the Angels have made in the past, and you just don't trust the front office. You don't trust ownership. And so I think that's why you say, why didn't this get done? If it doesn't get done now, it might not ever get done. And if it does, it's not going to get done well.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's interesting to point out that relationship with the GMs, because those are the things that probably weigh on this a lot more than we really take into account. And it very well could be the case. People just don't want to get that far down the road with Perry Minasian on these trades, but you've got to be the pursuer. You can't just expect the phone's going to ring on your guys, and if it's not ringing enough, you're just going to sit by and do nothing. Like, be a little proactive. You have these pieces that should be able to net you something. Make some calls outgoing if you want to. Just get something done, because I just feel like they have such a frustrating future ahead for their fan base that really has no light at the end of the tunnel. But you never know. You never know. Maybe a good off season and the Angels can get back into semi contention. Brent Rooker, I don't think he was in our article, because maybe we just viewed that as a guy that is part of building something in Oakland. I still thought it's worth mentioning that his market, I feel like, should have been pretty steep, the price at least, and maybe that couldn't have been found at this deadline. But another guy that I feel like could have netted a lot if he was dealt.
You got to wonder if it's the DH issue. Being said, Jorge Soler still is going to Atlanta, and he's still going to play outfield because Marcell Ozuna's there. So
we'll talk about that. We will talk about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, that is that part of it. But also the dude had 11 home runs in the month of July. So he was just scorching hot. And so, why didn't that come together? Don't really know, but that is one of the puzzling ones, because that would have netted a major return. And it was something I'm sure Oakland could have used, especially with Mason Miller going on the IL before the deadline. So that kind of prospect haul was no longer on the table. So, Rooker, one of your bigger pieces, you'd have to think that's a guy that you're shopping to try to, again, jumpstart some kind of rebuild. But at the same time, what's the window of the rebuild? Again, I think there's a lot of fan bases that are looking, and I've had some conversations yesterday on the Blake Street Banner podcast, talking about windows of contention and when you want to get all of your guys together at the same time, because the window of contention has to do with time, right? Yeah. So for the Oakland, when is their time? Is it going to be when they move into, a new building in Las Vegas? If so, you don't necessarily even need those guys yet. I don't know if that's the math going on behind the scenes, but it was certainly puzzling why Brent Rooker did not get moved.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that this was the time, as his value at as high as it could have possibly been. But again, at least for the A's, they have been playing a little bit better baseball as of late. I mean, they had a pretty good month. Maybe for them as a small market team, that is kind of like, let's have fun in Sacramento next year. I don't know. Maybe they can be a sneaky team. The A's have surprised us in the past, so I'll give them a little bit of a pass on that one. There's some pitchers though that I also thought should have moved. Jamison Tyone, that one, you can understand it when you make the trade for Isaac Paredes, that what they have right now is a rotation. And this race is not really, it hasn't gotten away from them. They could still, with a great August, get back in it. They're playing the Cardinals right now. Beat up on them, you might get back into the race a little bit. But Jamison Tyone had a really bad year last year, and he was pitching great this year. This would have been an opportunity to trade him, get some positive value back, and also get off of a contract that still might not be great for the next 2 years beyond this. I felt like that was a trade that probably should have happened from Chicago there.
Yeah, well, I think you summarized it well there, right? There were some question marks about him with his season last year, and some of the peripheral numbers suggest maybe he's been a little bit lucky this year with Chicago with all the money that was due. It might have required a little prospect capital to also send him away, or even paying down some of that contract. And it's just, you know what, it's better just to hold on to this guy, and maybe in the next 2 years we do get out of him what we had originally expected when we signed him. So I think that was probably part of the discussion.
I want to save the reliever for last, because I think that was one of the biggest misses of the deadline. So let's move over to Blake Snell. We're going to have a whole article come out on this one, because I feel like that was, again, kind of a missed opportunity. There's been some reporting that they were looking for a top 100 prospect and someone to take on that whole contract. If that's not out there, I guess I understand keeping him. Do the Giants have enough with a Blake Snell, Logan Webb, Robbie Ray rotation down the stretch to get back into this race? Was that justified in holding on to Snell instead of getting something for him and getting the contract off the books, knowing that he could just opt out this winter if he continues to pitch well?
And I don't think they can give him a qualifying offer because he's already received one.
Yeah.
So that's not a part of this either. I think they could. You mentioned those three names, and Robbie Ray obviously is a solid third because he's just coming back from Tommy John surgery. But you didn't mention Kyle Harrison, who's also been great as a rookie, and Hayden Birdsong. I know he's pitched very well against the Rockies, but you have those other two guys bringing up the back of that rotation, and it could allow you that opportunity to get in. So yeah, it's a half measure, but for a team that's dying to get back into the postseason, and other than that surprise 107 win season under the tutelage of Gabe Kapler, they're dying for some postseason. So I think it allowed them to have their cake and eat it too, in some ways. And with Snell really kind of hitting his stride. And if you believe him and saying, well, I didn't really have a spring training, so I'm only now starting to feel comfortable, he could be in midseason form in October. And as long as you get to that, get the third wild card, you really could make a deep run for a team that, again, has been around 500. This is just the way of baseball right now in 2024. All you got to do is make the postseason. And if you've got the dogs to do it, you can make a run. Texas had the dogs. Arizona had the dogs, despite being a relatively average team around 500. So for San Francisco to continue to invest, maybe not be at all in, because they did deal Soler, but for them to continue to invest in the 2024 roster, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm able to justify it by brain. I'm able to understand why they did it. Like, it makes some sense to me, but I don't know. I still just wonder if they were more aggressive on pursuing it, if somebody would have stepped up big time. If the Dodgers would have said, you know what, we could have Jack Flaherty or we could have Blake Snell. And maybe they would have taken that Flaherty package, added a little something to it. Although Dodgers, Giants making trades, that might be an issue. Let's stay out west with your Rockies. Cal Quantrill, it doesn't even seem like they shopped them. I know you're probably not surprised, but is it still frustrating that they didn't take advantage of what his market could have been?
I think so. I mean, his value has never been higher. I mean, we're talking about 7 months ago, he was on the scrap heap for the Cleveland Guardians because of some of the questions about some injuries that he had last season. And I think he's shown, those shoulder issues are not a concern, and he's gone out and had one of the best first year seasons for Rockies in history. We're talking like a 3.5 ERA at Coors Field. Like, the dude is a leader, and he has some value to the Rockies. But when you're losing back-to-back, when you're losing consecutive 100 loss seasons, how much value does any player have? I think value of prospects for when you're going to be relevant has a lot more value. So I think for a lot of Rockies fans, that was definitely frustrating. If you're Cal Quantrill, you're probably a little bit frustrated too, because you pitched well enough for someone to go out and offer the right package of prospects to get you out of Denver and get you back into another postseason run.
Yeah, no, I wonder how much frustration there is, out there from guys like him, Tyler Anderson, another one we haven't even mentioned, that are in their mind picturing, all right, I've pitched really well. I'm going to get to jump over to a contender. That even helps your market when you eventually get to free agency, pitching under the bright lights of a national stage. And you can't control what your current team does with you. And so they might just hang on